Hey, everybody, and welcome to the CMMC Compliance panel discussion webinar thing that we're doing today. We're going to talk about the journey to CMMC compliance and what you can learn, or at least the journey to achieving CMMC compliance. I have to say, so my name's Jake Milstein. I run marketing at CI. I am not an expert. I just play one on TV. Everybody else here is an expert. And they've all been making fun of me for talking about the company that achieved total compliance because they're like, that's not a thing. So but we have a lot of information put together for you. I see there are a bunch of people still coming into the room, so I will burn a tiny bit of time with a terrible joke here, which is the companies involved in accreditation here are C3PAOs. And so I was just saying to the group this morning, man, we should have done this on May the 4th because it's Star Wars Day and C3PO, but they didn't think that was as funny as I did. So anyway.
It's a little strained.
Oh boy. All right. Well, I hope everybody else on this at least got a chuckle or a groan out of that. Definitely a dad joke, and also your reminder that Mother's Day is this weekend.
I like Alethe's joke better.
All right, Alethe, tell your Star Wars joke, and then we'll get started.
Okay, here goes. So what is the temperature of a recently deceased tauntaun? Internal temperature. Anyone? No. It is lukewarm.
That's actually a really well-constructed joke.
It is really well constructed. I think a kid told me that joke. I was just thoroughly impressed.
The best jokes come from kids.
Yep.
And sometimes they're better when told by kids. But that was pretty good. All right, so let's do this. All right, so the folks who you've heard from in the background, Mike Hamilton is CI Security co-founder, former CISO of Seattle. Fred Langston founded the company with Mike, and he runs consulting for the organization. And Alethe Denis is expert in two very important things: intelligence and social engineering specialist, and she is a CMMC guide. She works with companies that are trying to figure out CMMC and their journey. And so Fred has a presentation, and then we'll go into the Q&A. Some of you have already emailed me questions. We will get to those. If you have other questions, please put them in the chat on the right. Alethe's already asking questions over there, but go ahead and put your questions in as we go, and I'll make sure we ask them. Fred, the floor is yours.
You got it. So thank you very much, Jake. So today I want to cover kind of the journey of three different companies and how they're facing CMMC, and what does it mean to them, and what does it mean because their businesses all have some fundamental differences. So hopefully when we look at these three kind of composite examples, you'll see yourselves somewhere in here, or you'll see some of the challenges that you're facing, because each one of these entities face differing kind of challenges in getting through the CMMC process. So the first one, it's a company that makes sprockets. Okay, they design them, they produce them, and they use them in high-performance defense systems. It's one location, a relatively modest-sized company, about 75 people. They do design and they manufacture, right? So they're basically a producer of a part that is used in defense systems. Slate Construction is a significantly larger organization. They help build some of the stuff in defense facilities. So if they're building a new, let's say, airbase somewhere, they might be out there building the fencing systems around that. And they have four main offices around the U.S. A couple of places they do fabrication, but they also have a challenge in that they have to build a construction office every time they're building one of these new facilities, and that office has the type of data that needs to be protected. So not only do they have four locations and a couple fabrication, they've also got this concept of something that will be built and torn down. It needs to be compliant in the process. And then we have a research university, which is very large. It has 6 major departments. They're all doing some form of DoD grant work, but the work is very, very different. Some of it's in biology, some of it's in engineering. It's very, very different disciplines and different departments that normally don't work together. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about 2 different things, and what is it that we're trying to do in this CMMC world. The first thing to understand is there's 2 different types of data that they're requiring you to protect. One of it is called CUI, or Controlled Unclassified Information. So it's not secret or top secret, but it's controlled. It's controlled information that they care about. So what kind of data would that be? Well, there's a huge list, and there are a bunch of websites that have huge algorithms to help you figure out what exactly is or is not CUI. But think of it as all the things that go into something you might build that could give a threat or an adversary an advantage. So if I were to be able to know the composition of the steel and the bolts being made to fasten together internal walls of a submarine, if I knew what that composition was, I would be able to design an explosive that would have enough power to shear those bolts and potentially cause a failure. That's the concept of what they're trying to protect. So it can be as simple as a specification for something you're building for the government. It can be as simple as the pitch on the screws if you're building screws. Much more commonly, it can be much more advanced types of information, and it doesn't just have to be about parts. It can be about processes. It can be about government employees. If you're providing a service where you could use that to determine what roles people might have in an intelligence organization, that's controlled unclassified information. And there's another set, and that is called federal contract information. That's the stuff that just says, hey, we're on the project that's building the bolts. Okay, it's not the bolt specification, but it's, hey, spacely sprockets. Yeah, we build the sprockets for the government. That's federal contract information. Why is this important? Well, there's 2 levels that you need to move to protect each type of information. So if you're looking at something that is controlled unclassified information, CUI or CUI, that almost always is a minimum of level 3. Level 3 is the middle of the CMMC scale. There are 5 levels. Levels 1 and 2 are for federal contract information, a lower bar to protect because it's just that you're doing work for the government on a particular contract. But once you get into, and here's the specification for the work we're doing, then that becomes CUI, and it becomes level 3. So this is important to these differing organizations because you can attack this in a number of ways. You can say, one part of my organization, the factory floor that's doing fabrication, that's where we're actually have CUI. But our back office, where we're doing accounts payable, that's only FCI. So for some of these organizations, it's looking at, can I split the environments, if you will, to where I have a lower level of requirements over on this side, maybe the back office, and maybe a higher set of requirements over here on the factory floor. This is not always possible, but this is one of the goals and one of the challenges and the things you should strive for when you're starting to approach CMMC compliance is drawing particular boundaries around where this information lives. If possible, it will help you. Commonly, it's not possible. So spacely sprockets, they need to be a level 3 because they have both types of information. Slate construction, they only have level 1 and 2. They just have contract information, right? They're not actually having, specifications or plans. It's just work orders they have to go out and do certain things. So they're only a level 1, level 2 CMMC target. But they do have that transportable model. They have to build the model when they build a construction site. I need to be able to go out and actually push that construction model so it's secure when I build that site out there. The question may be that maybe they do have CUI on those mobile sites. In this instance, we've determined, luckily, in their instance, they do not. And then we have the research university, which has both CUI and FCI in 6 departments with wildly different missions. So they realize they need to become level 3. So their concept became, we need to consolidate everything. We need to create an environment that is strictly for this regulated computing and storage of data. So not only did they say, let's create one shared service area for all these 6 different departments to work in, they said, we're going to move it to the cloud too, because frankly, building it ourselves is probably too much of a lift to manage over time. Let's outsource that incomplete component and take it off our plate. Next slide, please. So we'll talk about Spacely Sprockets. What was the process for them? I mentioned, we need to document the system description. You'll see these things are common to all of these. So that was really going in and just making sure we understand where the FCI and the CUI was. I will tell you that this is a huge challenge. By regulation, all this data is supposed to be marked. When it comes into you from the government, it should have headers and footers with some very formal markings. There's actually a bunch of guides the government provides, both for your use and for the government use, to mark all this data. We can also tell you with 100% assurance that data comes in that won't be marked, and you will be creating data that, unless you have a very robust system to mark it yourself, or a technology that automatically classifies and marks it as it's created, which is frankly very expensive and few companies have, you're basically going to be thinking about just, most of my data, if it's on the factory floor, I'm just going to consider all of that probably likely CUI, because it's too expensive for me to go and figure out exactly which pieces are. Now, certainly it's a requirement to mark that and classify that data, but again, it's a very imperfect science, as we've found. Then you need to go in and do a gap analysis against level 3. So that's 130 different controls. It's a very wide range of things, from some of the basic cyber hygiene things on up to more advanced processes and management procedures around information security. But you need to go through and see how your organization is doing in comparison to every one of those 130 standards in there. Once we've determined where you're at, or you'd have determined where you're at, you need to draft what they call a System Security Plan, or SSP. This is the document that will live forever, because you will maintain it when it's created, literally forever. It has to be maintained all the time with the most latest information about what your environment has, what controls are in place, who is managing those controls, and how they're managing them. So it's a true plan end to end. So that needs to be foundationally created. But there are things that are going to be gaps. And the things that are gaps go into another document called a Plan of Actions and Milestones, or a POAM. That's basically a roadmap, but it's a roadmap on steroids, because not only are you committing to, I'm going to get these things done, you're actually going to be putting some dates on that POAM and saying, here is when we're going to have this control in place by. So if you want to consider yourself on a path towards being able to be certified, you need to start hitting these milestones, and this needs to be a real plan on which you actually are going to be able to enact and enable and complete on the schedule that you put in that plan. Again, when you're done with building, then you're maintaining. All these things get maintained, and as milestones in the POAM get hit, they get moved over into the System Security Plan. At some point, hopefully you do not have a POAM anymore, and you just have a System Security Plan that lives on forever, is maintained forever. And at that point, you're ready to go and hire a certification body. They're just now, the government is just finally got a few crops of them, if you will, available. I will tell you the backlog is immense. You need to get in line early if you want to get certified sometime within this year. So your process for all of these things to get ready is significant before you're ever ready to go through the actual certification process. Next slide, please. So slate construction, very similar, but we're doing two different system descriptions here. Two SSPs and two POEMs will come out of this. We have the one for the 4 locations and the fabs, and then we have one for that transportable model. In other words, that office that gets built on site for projects. So this instance, we're measuring both of these separate system descriptions against level 2, drafting 2 system security plans, not one, because it's the plans should be different because you're maintaining them in a very different manner. One never changes. The project office should never change. It should be cookie cuttered. The equipment, the build, the process of moving it there, of lighting it up, of closing it down, all should be the same every time and follows exactly what's on your SSP. We create, again, this project model infrastructure that we want to repeat over and over, and then we maintain these system security plans in perpetuity as well. Again, at that point, you're ready for certification. So let's go to the last example. It's a little bit more challenging and complex at the approach that they had to take. They decided, as I mentioned, to move to the cloud. There are cloud environments like GovCloud and AWS. There's a similar things in Google Cloud and in Azure and in IBM Cloud. They all have differing analogs to this, but they're built to be compliant to the government requirements. In the GovCloud model, they have or GovCloud environment. It's built with all the controls that should support a CMMC environment. And in fact, there is a document that you can get and should get when you go to migrate to a cloud. It'll be their shared responsibility model document, which says, if I'm AWS, for CMMC or the ISO or whatever standard, here is what we do and here's how we do it. You then are required to take the leftovers, the things that are left to be done for CMMC, and those become your responsibilities. So you're building a matrix that shows, here's all the requirements, here's what AWS does, and here's what we do. So a system security plan for this will refer to all the things that are requirements and talk about whose responsibility it is to do those things. Once we've done that, then we can do a gap analysis against our remaining requirements that are ours. And at that point, this entity decided, you know what, once we're moving everything into the cloud, we might as well move our desktop infrastructure into the cloud as well. We can use a virtual desktop infrastructure in Amazon. So I don't have to build anything now on the workstations. They're basically dumb terminals that are connecting to this virtual desktop infrastructure. Everything for CMMC is being managed holistically in one place. Everything perimeter to it, even when people are essentially connecting from their office in their university, facilities, they're essentially using technology footprint that is entirely controlled and encased, if you will, to a large degree within AWS. So this is outsourced, a huge problem, a management problem, an architectural problem, and put it entirely into an environment built to handle this exact type of work. They also realized they did need to spend money on an auto classification and tagging system. This group of people were not well trained in understanding, how to tag government data. They're great at genomics and things like that. So they decided to invest in something so the data would be appropriately tagged. They went in, developed a system security plan of actions and milestones, just like everyone else, and they were ready to become certified at that point. And frankly, it was somewhat of a lower lift in the certification process because they had less, in essence, to prove, less artifacts to provide to verify their controls, because the auditors take the word of Google or AWS or Azure for their controls around this. Next slide, please. So the outcomes, Spacely Sprockets, they're on their way to a January certification shot. They're trying to line up their testing, their certification audit right now. To get there, though, they had to do a number of things. They had to outsource some of the functions. They outsourced their firewall to a managed firewall provider that could provide CMMC compliance services. Same thing with managed detection, monitoring, and response. They hired a vCISO to actually manage this, a virtual partial CISO, to have that governance role, because it was required by their policy. And they had policies developed to support this. And they had an IR plan developed and a tabletop exercise. If you're familiar with the history of CMMC, it used to be driven by a regulation, still driven regulatory perspective by DFARS, the Defense Acquisition Regulations. And one of the very first initial requirements ever was the DoD said, if you're going to bid, you at least has to show us your IR plan. That was 2 years ago. That was a requirement in January 2 years ago. So, all these things were things they needed to fill in the blanks. Next slide, please. Slate Construction, they basically didn't have to do as much. They bought some, outsourced their monitoring. They did have to do some vulnerability scanning. They decided to outsource that as well. And they had to get some manual testing in place. So penetration testing, those two together, basically they outsourced their vulnerability management component, which is something, of course, that was not core to a construction company. Their particular efforts are pretty much in place, and they're in SSP maintenance mode, about ready to do their certification coming up in a couple months. One more slide, and I think we're going to be close to wrapping up here. As I mentioned, the University of Bedrock, they migrated to GovCloud. They used auto tagging. They did have to buy a Cloud Access Security Broker or CASB to manage the access in and out of the cloud. That was another weak point and a huge sticky point for a lot of people in becoming compliant with CMMC. So again, they bought a technology to help them. They got MFA, multi-factor authentication. They outsourced detection and monitoring. And same as the others, they needed to get an IR plan that was holistic for that new environment, because their existing old plan, while good, had nothing to do with this new environment they built. So they had to build a new one for that as well. They're looking out almost sometime in next year to be ready to do this. So while a lot of this is happening, there's still a lot of stuff that has to get in place. So that's 3 stories. Let's go to the next slide here, Jake.
And this is where we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, as we get to the Q&A.
So, and I'll drop the slides as we get to it. So Alethe, Denis has been working with companies that have, obviously, Fred's companies were made up ones. If you're a fan of the Flintstones, you sort of got the joke on the company names there. If you haven't watched the Flintstones, don't watch the movie. Watch the
Spacely
cartoon.
Sprockets is the Jetsons, man. Come on.
Oh, you're right. All right. Yeah. All right. All the old Hanna-Barbera ones. All right. So Alethe, you've been working with companies. What kind of gaps are you seeing?
Honestly, I feel that the biggest gap and what would actually go a very long way to helping many companies be better poised to pursue certification is they can close a tremendous amount of gap by having what I see kind of as a triangle in my mind of relationships between the practice, what they're actually doing, the policy that supports what they're doing, and then the evidence to support that they're actually doing it. And I feel that a lot of organizations that we've worked with are really reliant on tribal knowledge and the fact that everybody just knows that everybody's doing it and that's how we've always done it, as opposed to having formal policies and documentation that lays out what their process is, and then the evidence to support that, whether that's actual logging, screenshots of certain systems, or something as simple as having a camera at the door to take images of people as they're coming and going from sensitive areas. And that really is the biggest gap. I mean, for the most part, when I have to say that an organization is not meeting the control, it's because they don't have one of those three things. Either they don't have a policy, they can't show me proof that they're doing the thing, or they're not actually doing the thing.
Well, not actually doing the thing is so.
That's an interesting point, and it kind of makes me think, and maybe you can verify this from your experience, because you two are the ones that have a lot of experience here. I'm here for just because I'm good looking. Wouldn't it be true then that smaller, less mature, maybe not having been in business so long, companies would find it easier because they haven't spread out and they don't have all that tribal knowledge and all those pockets of how they do things and where stuff is stashed? I think if you're a smaller company and you pull off this scab now and get it done, you're done, right? But if you're a larger company, I mean, it's the size of the lift goes up, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it's also easier for companies who don't have any policies to either outsource or create policies of their own, starting from scratch. Typically reviewing, hundreds of policy documents and trying to update those would be a lot more difficult than just creating all new policies. And sometimes that's my recommendation, like just trash the policies that reference dial-up modems and clamshell cell phones as the limit of where those technologies were, and just start over, because it's going to be too difficult to really find and identify each of the gaps in your existing policies to meet the new standards, rather than creating all new policies that check every box and that you're confident do that.
Yeah, that's probably great advice.
So Adam emailed in before this started and asked a question. One of the biggest hurdles I'm having with our CMMC compliance is the procedures around identifying and marking CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. From what I understand, we're supposed to be receiving documents that contain CUI that are marked accordingly. However, we have yet to see any documents from anyone that have been marked appropriately. Is there a best practice for this? Fred, you just worked on something like this.
Yeah. So working with a very large and famous company that's literally struggling daily with this exact problem. And after an enormous amount of research, there's some great guidance from the government. The DoD has 3 or 4, CUI marking guides that are really good. I mean, and frankly, it's a pretty simple system, right? This is not classified, so it should just have CUI in big bold letters at the header and optionally at the footer, and then it may have 2 slashes and then something else, another set of codes, which means it's CUI with some modifier or extension on it. But the concept should be pretty simple, that everything that's built should be built on a watermarked document that has this on it. Now, is that happening? No. Is the government good at doing it? No. Are people good at doing it themselves, unless they have an automated technology? No, they're not. What's more challenging still? CUI can occur during a call like this. We can be talking about a particular project, and I can start discussing a specification for something that the government provided to us. And I've just created a moment in this presentation that legitimately should be marked as CUI. And there are, believe it or not, there are technologies to go in and mark this part of the video and say CUI, and flashing banners come up that this is CUI during this portion of the discussion. Do I know anybody that's doing that? Probably not. I mean, I don't think. Nobody's told me they have.
The inability to, not inability, but how hard some of this stuff is to do, and how this is, if you are DOD and you do your talking in a skiff and everything is marked top secret, with the slashes and, or FOU or whatever, all that is, easy to think through because that's the way you live. But the company, there's been good pushback on this as well. And, you guys know a lot about the detail of this. I'm really interested in what's the ultimate fate here. I know that Congress is going to take a look at this program because there have been so many complaints from the private sector about how onerous these requirements are to meet, and how smaller companies, you know, how are you going to compete? I mean, so ultimately, this is, you know, security as a competitive differentiator, right? You got to be so secure to do business with us, and which in principle is a good idea. But when it becomes regulatory and you are pushing exactly the same requirements down on every vendor contractor that handles a certain kind of information, you know, that could drive people out of business. And you know, my interest is in kind of where this is all going after Congress has a look at it, and whether or not this program is going to take on any maybe different shape. Have you, either of you, heard anything about that? You know, and in the beginning too, the accreditation body had lots of fits and starts and was under a microscope for, you know, some kind of chicanery going on in there, and I don't really remember what that was, but you know, is this program solid? This is going to continue, and everybody's sure of that, and these are good investments to make because we know that they're not going to bait and switch this?
So
those are hard questions. I don't really, those are almost rhetorical.
I will say that I believe there's critical mass now with the number of people that have gone through to become a certified or accredited certifiers. That particular body of work and investment by a lot of companies will push this forward one way or the other. Yeah. It's going to happen. What was interesting, like you alluded to, was actually U.S. government, I think it was senators from New York, I think, that were wildly opposed to this, saying you're putting huge burden on people that make, you know, industrial coatings for DoD and fasteners and, you know, build, you know, some very, you know, basic things that do go onto defense facilities, but they're still relatively basic, and it's a huge challenge. So the pushback is there, but I think the thing that I always fall back on is the way I've read it, and I believe this is still the interpretation, is you can still bid, you just fall to the absolute lowest tier of desirability, meaning everybody with a certification will have to fall away before they ever come to you and say, okay, nobody has this, so we'll buy your widget from you at that point.
Hey, and Fred, I do want to get back to this question of the you know, CUI here. So if you're an organization and you're not getting anything that's marked this way, but it's part of what you're supposed to be doing, what do you do?
So most people that we talk to have come to this conclusion at the same time we have, and that is it's all about just compartmentalization, right? That's why this move to GovCloud. Let's do everything we do that has to do with this in one place, and let's do it there. The same concept, you know, people are trying to do that, you know, locally on-prem organizations, but the problem there is most of the time I have to draw a big circle around my entire organization because I just can't slice and dice it. Sometimes it's too expensive to put an extra firewall and manage that just so I can have a slightly lower level of stuff in back office than I do factory floor. And then the other part of this we haven't even touched on is none of the FCI is marked. Okay, that's just for you to know.
Right, but you know what's
that's FCI. Okay, so the whole thing is a little challenging, right? And the best thing usually to do is assume, you know, the largest boundaries you can while attempting to shrink them at the same time, and come to something that you feel comfortable with. That, okay, I'm as small as I can be, but I think everything is inside, you know, my perimeters, and now I build the plan and the controls and everything else to go with that.
And Fred and Alethe, you know, there have to be some innovative ways of dealing with all this, right? I mean, or is it just using GovCloud?
No, there are some creative ways that you can check the box, so to speak, on each of the controls. There are ways that you can be in compliance that are, you know, unconventional or creative in nature, and as long as you can demonstrate that you have that goal in mind that you're making progress towards, achieving that level 3 certification, and that this process has happened over time. You have evidence that this has been occurring for some time, and not just say, you started last week and you have one document. But I have heard that they are discussing relaxing some of the the strict guidelines, and of course this is all rumor at this point, so I don't want to speculate beyond that. But there are situations where you may only qualify to be certified at level 1, even if you are shooting for level 3, and say you fail a number of the level 3 specific controls to achieve that level of compliance, you may still be able to get certified to level 1 based on other controls and checking all of those boxes. But I did see a question in the chat about how many items you can fail in order to still receive compliance. And it is not something that really works that way. There's no 80% pass rate. It must be it is yes or a no, and if you have any no's, you do not qualify to be certified. And that's where I think having a plan and having a roadmap in place and someone to support you through this journey, if you're not confident taking it all on yourself, can be extremely beneficial.
I would throw out that, and this is where I think some people maybe got the idea that you can have a score that's not perfect, that the DFAR right now, in lieu of being certified, you still have to turn in your DFAR score sheet. So there's a Excel score sheet. You go in and say if things are in place or not. And that does have a minimum acceptable score for you to then say, okay, I feel, or I'm attesting to this, and I can now submit my bid. That's going away. We're waiting for that checkered flag to drop, and that's done. Okay?
Yeah,
and
it's because
during this call. Okay?
Self-assessments are aspirational every time,
Right,
and if they're not auditable, what you say doesn't hold that much weight.
Right, but that's probably where some people have. Hey, I heard there's a less than perfect score, and yes, you can get a less than perfect score on the 800 171 worksheet, but that's going away in minutes, literally. And you got to be ready for CMMC, and that's all or nothing, right?
Go ahead,
I just wanted to say, if any of you have ever been through what it's like going through a PCI
same thing
environment, it's very similar, very prescriptive, very artifact heavy. You will prove everything. There's no yes or no, I've got it. It's okay, prove it. And you're going to be pulling out a log artifact, a policy, a config document, something, right, that they're going to ask you for.
Yeah, which is one of the things that you need to do, after a gap assessment and you start working on your POAM. One of the things really that you need to do, and I just went through an audit, you have to get your systems making all kinds of records that you will retain. And that's a bit of a lift too. Making sure that you're not only generating those logs, but you have them in some kind of condition as to where when an auditor asks you for an artifact, you can find it fairly easily. And there's a little bit of engineering and some syslogging that's going to have to go on there as well.
And so, and while this is definitely not a sales presentation, Alethe, you and Fred have been working with companies on CMMC now for months. What is it that CI does for companies in this who are looking at all this?
We do put together a pretty robust package of services, and those are really unique to the organization's needs, but central to the things that we will provide are the gap analysis, and then we'll get companies started by creating their first or initial pass at an SSP and a POAM. I know Fred mentioned specifically what we delivered to the 3 organizations used as examples earlier on, and each one of those packages was a little bit differently put together based on what we felt were the best things that we could help that company to achieve their goals based on their environment. And I'm trying to redact things in my brain, so forgive me for not coming off super polished here, but creating things like the system description, completing a gap analysis, putting together an initial POAM, and then creating the initial draft of that SSP. We then hand those things over to the client organization so that they can use those as living documents, update them on an ongoing basis, and then, you know, radio for help if they need it along the way.
And I know you've worked with you know, several organizations up to this point. You know, Fred, you know, you likened it to PCI. Are there other things that are similar, or is this really its own thing?
Well, you know, as part of this is the change, right? It was when it was DFARS, right? Which we've been doing DFARS work for 5 years now. And the standard, so when you see level 3, you're actually looking at everything that was in the previous standard 800-171, both appendices, plus a few extra controls they throw on top. So to be honest, you've always had to be in compliance with all these same controls, but it's just now that everybody's finally getting forced and having an auditor coming in and certifying it. So, you know, what's happening here is something that's not frankly new. And that's one reason the government feels a little bit of carte blanche about enforcing it is you were always supposed to do it. Now you're just complaining because we're checking. So that's kind of where things are gotten to here. Yeah.
I mean, this trend started a long time ago, and it really started in the health sector, honestly, when they said that anybody who is a business associate of a covered entity, meaning some kind of supplier, vendor to a hospital, basically, is also technically under the HIPAA requirements. Right. And, you know, the FFIEC has been doing this for a long time, making everybody look at their third parties and demonstrate not only that you have a third party security management program, but that you're able to demonstrate its effectiveness. A lot of this is all about third parties. And because the federal government is such a gigantic customer, it's got all of these third parties that it's trying to control. That's really what is at the core of this. And this is not going to go away. I think it is going to morph a little bit, because I think they set the bar in a spot that does, you know, have an impact on the private sector that's not the one that they want. You know, but more examples of this are coming. I'm seeing what Congress is doing around things like this and how ticked off they are about SolarWinds and Exchange and all these things. And it's all going to be about supply chain. Everything you're going to hear about in the upcoming year is going to be about supply chain security.
Well, I mean, and that makes sense. You know, I know this is not a healthcare thing, but one of the things so we did an analysis of healthcare breaches, and one of the things we found was, Mike, what is it? 80%?
Yeah, 75%.
75% of healthcare breaches in the back half of 2020 actually came from third-party breaches. And so, you know, when Mike says, you know, we're going to see a lot of that, I think it's pretty clear why that whole supply chain third-party issue is, you know, everybody's thinking about it.
Well, I mean, all you have to do is look at SolarWinds. That's exactly what this whole thing is about, right? Because the government, DOD, got hammered because they're using SolarWinds, and hopefully this particular set of requirements might have helped, although I'm not so sure that
I was about to ask that. I mean, would it? What I mean, you know, you look at the big third party breaches, you know, Excellion, Blackbaud, Tyler Tech, SolarWinds, you know, would the CMMC fix that?
No,
probably not.
I don't think so.
If someone was held to level 5, it's possible, because there's a lot higher level of assurance, but that's usually only applied to top secret data. So I've never heard anybody yet. I mean, we have a client that may have level 4 or level 5 data. They're still trying to figure out if they do or not. So,
and I will say this with respect to your previous question, Jake. You know, what do we do? So when you're talking about especially level 4 and level 5, the whole thing about monitoring and how you have to monitor your networks, that becomes increasingly important. And setting up, you know, a functioning monitoring infrastructure, making sure it's staffed and making sure that alerts are always investigated and things like this, that's a heavy lift. and pitching that over the fence to somebody to say, monitor my network, investigate events, put out little fires before they get big, is a fast track to those higher maturity levels.
And speaking of
one component of a fast track.
Yeah, and speaking of the maturity levels, Don has a comment here. Level 1 is only 17 controls.
Yeah.
And obviously there are 5 levels of this. I mean, most companies don't need to get to level 5. Like level
Hardly
1,
anybody.
2, depending on what you have, right?
We're working with one right now, and it makes us have to do a lot of things.
We're working with one that has to get to level 5, you mean?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Well, we shouldn't talk about this.
So but most companies don't need to get to level 5, right?
Right. Well, level 3, to be honest, we've talked to one company that even had an inkling that they may need to go above level 3. The thing that I think is important for people is to try to determine if it's possible to only go to level 2, right? And to be totally honest, there's still an argument as to whether FCI should be level 1 or level 2, but most people are saying, well, let's play it safe and just go level 2. But that's probably the one thing you might be able to do is say, hopefully I don't have CUI, I've only got FCI, right? Now, I don't think that's going to apply to very many people. And usually if it does, it'll be in organizations that have, like I said, they have a contract function that's in a different building than ops and design and all manufacturing and stuff like that.
Cool. So we're getting towards the end of time here. I do want to hit on 2 points, which is, managed detection response is one of the things we do, which means we respond, we monitor your system for, for threats and intrusions. That's one way to jumpstart CMMC, right, Fred?
Yeah.
Good. Excellent. The other thing is, I want to get to, if anybody else has a question, go ahead and put it in chat.
Yeah, somebody threw a question in the chat.
You threw a question.
That's why I was reading Hamilton's question there, Jake, and because I saw him.
Will there be? I mean, is this one and done? Are they going to come back every year? I mean, that's the part I don't understand. You get compliant. You got to do your PCI song and dance every year. Is this going to be an every year thing?
I can't imagine it wouldn't be. Well, to be honest,
I see a whole bunch of people typing that are every 3 years.
Okay. Every 3 years. That's right. Yeah.
3-year cycle. 3-year cycle, but it's also if you have a new RFP that you're answering, a new government RFP, don't you have to? You would have. I mean, depending on the level that the RFP requires, you might have to do it again under 3 years, right?
No.
If you wanted to go to a higher level to get up.
If you have to go to a higher level,
yeah.
But
only if you're trying to achieve a higher level to get that new business. Say you're certified at level 1, for example, and you need to be certified at level 3 to do it, then yeah, I would say you'd have to get certified again at level 3. But I think one thing to note would be that many organizations can reduce a lot of cost by preparing to do this, ahead of time. Nobody's getting actually certified for probably the next year or so. It's probably not going to happen. So use that time to start identifying where your gaps are now, and if that's policy creation or what do we do for this? Do we even have an incident response plan? Did we print that out, or is it on the system that would be going down when we have an incident? Like those types of questions are things that organizations should start asking themselves, and then seek help. Because asking for help is great. And if you have a third party that can, validate what you say you're doing, so that it goes beyond just a self-assessment, that's going to go a long way to holding you accountable for actually performing and then making progress towards your goal of certification.
Sure. So that makes sense and fits very well with, I was going to say, last thoughts for folks, and that is a perfect last thought to leave folks with. Fred, last thoughts for folks. And while Fred talks, folks. I'm going to put up our email addresses. Mine is the easiest because I'm the vain one. It's just jake@ci.security, and I can connect you with whoever. I'm also going to put a survey in the chat. We do a survey in every event we do for two reasons. One, we want to know your opinions and how we're doing. And number two is if you take the
Marketing
survey,
malware.
if you if you take the survey, we'll send you a gift card, or you can send your gift card to a food bank if you like. Something we started at the beginning of the pandemic, and it works well. All right, Fred, and please take the survey. Fred, final thoughts.
Yep. Consolidate, compartmentalize, minimize everything. You may need to rethink your IT footprint, and if you're thinking about going to the cloud, this may be a good time to consider that and moving into a pre-compliant environment like GovCloud.
Cool. Mike, final thoughts.
I think the evolution of this CMMC, starting with DFARS in 171 and then turning it into the maturity model certification process was really ham-handed in the beginning. I think that dust has settled, and they just installed in the accreditation body, they just installed a new CEO that comes from CISO, from DHS, and it looks like they're on a good track now. So this is not going to go away. I think it's going to morph a little bit and be a little more respectful of the breadth of private sector businesses that are involved, but it's here to stay. And we are going to create a nationwide bench of thousands of auditors. Yes, we are.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And Alethe and Fred and Mike, thanks for joining.
You're going to give Alethe last thoughts, dude?
She had the first last thought.
Oh, I just kind of took them, but I teeny tiny last thing. I know that a lot of folks get confused between levels of maturity and then the levels of certification. So just keep in mind that while there are different levels of maturity, those are not correlated to the levels of certification. So be mindful of what controls are required at each level, and dig deeper into what each one of those are and how to tackle those specifically. And again, we're here to help.
That makes sense. See, now Alethe had two last thoughts. Mike, you happy?
I took them.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks very much. Also, if you have good Star Wars jokes, send them our way. We want to hear those too. And please take that survey. And we hope that you all have a great day. Thank you very much.
And Kevin, I'll get those tattoos in the mail to you.
Nice.
Yes, we have temporary tattoos with our logo. If people want those,
At least we tell people they're temporary.
Only mine's not.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye,
have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.